if you'll allow me,
you are committing that you will be working to even that out, I guess, so that we are not funding big companies at the expense of our local media that are having to close their doors because of this unfair competition.
We've already started working on that, and as I said, I think that this year's numbers, once they become available and they've been compiled, will show that we've started changing that trend. But the issue is not resolved. I'm the first one to admit.
And I'm just going to follow up a little bit on my colleague, Mr. Shampoo. Mr. Ripley earlier on today told us that the CRTC will not be able to change the direction on the ineligibility of non-Canadians to licenses, which protects, of course, Canadian ownership of Canadian media. I still don't quite understand why give up protecting Canadian ownership of conventional broadcasters through the Act. Why is it not possible to take into account both the commercial reality of foreign online businesses and the protection of Canadian ownership of conventional broadcasters through the Act?
As Mr. Ripley explained earlier, we're not sacrificing the ownership of Canadian broadcasters. We're not. That's simply not the case. What we're doing is that through those modifications in the proposed bill, we are ensuring that Canadian laws and regulations can apply to online platforms, which they can't right now. If we don't create a space in the bill to do that, how can we apply our laws and regulations to them? And if we don't do that, then this whole discussion about those 830 additional millions for Canadian culture will never be able to manifest themselves.
Thank you, Minister. Mr. Chair, I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you, Ms. McPherson. Now we go to Mr. Waugh for our second round. Mr. Waugh, go ahead, please.
Okay, thank you, and welcome, Minister from Montreal and your officials. Thank you, one and all, for being here today. It was interesting. I was listening to your conversation about moving money out of the platforms into Canadian media, and yet rural newspapers in this country are getting less and less money from your government. And it wasn't long ago that John Hines, who is the CEO of Newspapers Canada, had a blank page on Torstar, the Toronto Globe and Mail, and other papers in this country, complaining about this. They're in deep trouble because of Facebook and Google and so on. And we had Kevin Chan, as you know, in committee saying it's no problem. We're actually aiding them instead of hampering them. Your comments on that, because we deal with newspapers out west, and even during the COVID pandemic, the Winnipeg Free Press only got 2 ads from you talking about COVID-19. So I fail to see where you're putting money in newspapers and local media.
Thank you, Mr. Waugh, for your question. Well, it may have only been 2 ads, and we would have to verify that. But under the Harper government, it would have been 0 ads. So I guess two is better than 0. That's the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say is that we have provided close to $800 million of funding since budget 2019 to help Canadian media through this crisis. And the third thing I would say, which I said in my remarks initially, is that we are working on a bill. I mean, the broadcasting is not the same as media, but I'm on record many times saying that I'm in favor of fair compensation for Canadian media by web giants like Facebook and Google. I therefore respectfully disagree with Mr. Chan's comments publicly or to this committee. I have at Canada's initiative, we've started an international coalition of countries working together to do just that with Australia, Germany, France, Finland, and soon enough many others. So I don't think we've been passive on this. We've been very proactive.
2020 was a rough year for many organizations, and I think that many of them want to thank you for the $500 million you put forward your department in 2020, and I think you've already done over $300 million this year. But saying that, the reality remains that the budget at Canadian Heritage, as I see it, is unprecedented and it's unsustainable level. So is there any plans in your department right now to get spending back to more normal levels in the future once this pandemic is over?
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Yes. My apologies. Go ahead.
Just we've had a pretty wide-ranging conversation until now, but this seems far afield from C10 at this point. And I was wondering if we could bring it back to a conversation about the modernization of the Broadcasting Act.
Mr. Brusen, thank you very much for that. And you are correct. The last two questions, or the last two questioners, and certainly the last 10 minutes, have been somewhat far afield about some of the issues that we have addressed, both and in the first round as well. Now, I normally like to give my colleagues the time that they deserve within their allotted time, and I tend to give them a lot of freedom. As you know, for example, in estimates that we talk about, we can talk about pretty much anything in the presence of the minister as long as it pertains to the department. However, that being said, I would like to remind my colleagues this certainly is about C10. And some of it has been tangential to the point where I get it, but some of the other stuff has been, as Mr. Brusen pointed out, has been far afield. Can we please bring it back, whether it be at the core of C10 or tangentially at C10? Please, for the sake of the legislation that we are studying. So, Mr. Waugh, you have about let me do my math very quickly. You have about 2 minutes to conclude. And thank you, Mr. Brusen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for your comments. I do need to get a life as I took part in the CBC regulation in the CRTC in January, and I was surprised to know that your government funds CBC to the tune of $1.7 billion. And what I found surprising, Minister, that the British regulator recently capped BBC spending at digital at 10%. CBC, I don't know if you know it, they're at 20% and rising in this country. They're taking money away from CBC radio, in fact, as TV is number one, followed by their digital platform. Is this the way, as Mr. Ripley said in his report last hour, is this a way for broadcasters to better compete against the digital monopoly that the CBC seems to have in this country?
Where to start? CBC does not have a monopoly. There are plenty of other broadcasters across the country, both on radio and television. I think that what CBC is doing in terms of moving some content online is what a number of broadcasters are doing. We could be talking about Bell Media. We could be talking about Québécois. We could be talking about. This is because more and more users. I know for a fact that my kids don't listen to the radio as I do, and certainly don't read newspapers in like paper copy like I do. That's not how they get their information. So I think that what the CBC is doing is a reflection of what pretty much everybody is doing in the market. What we're trying to do with C10 is to ensure that Canadian broadcasters and Canadian producers of culture and artists get their fair share out of this transformation.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Housefather. 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And my questions will be about C10. But before that, I just want to tell the Minister I really appreciated his presentation. I would like to ask him to think about the proposed cuts at Radio-Canada International that are about to come up. I think they're, I hope the Minister is looking at that. I think those cuts are problematic. I also wanted to say I can't wait to see the Minister when he comes forward with regulations related to removal of illegal content on online platforms.
Well, there seems to be a confusion between.
Good to see some of you again. Mr. Piché, I heard different words used: freedom of expression, legislation to control some kinds of speech. But then I just mentioned about how the CRTC interprets the regulations, and then not over-regulated, and then policy direction to the CRTC. So, I'm just listening, but there sounds like some differentiation right in those statements that doesn't quite match. Do you want to respond to that, Mr. Piché?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Shields. Mr. Chair, the positioning the CRTC is extremely important in that space. Creating the right distance between the broadcasters and government is very important. That's why you have an organization, a regulator like the CRTC, which is arm's length. That's why we need to find that balance, the delicate balance between the ability of government to instruct the CRTC about certain policy change that it wants to have, and find a way that's very well determined to be able to operate that, and to leave the CRTC a marge de manœuvre so that they can find the best way to adapt these instructions to the context of broadcasting as it evolves. If we can, and that's a delicate balance. That's why the work on the directive is going to be so important, because it does calibrate the ability of government to interject. And in fact, we've had many issues in terms of the old Section 7 in the legislation, provided that means, and it's been used, I believe once or maybe twice in the last 30 years. So it's very seldom that it's used, but sometimes when things happen in the ecosystem, government needs to intervene, and this way it has a way to do so while maintaining the distance with the CRTC.
And I understand that, but when I hear a statement that says, well, how the CRTC interprets the regulations, that gets me, as we've had witnesses, very concerned with the powers you're creating. And we both well know that it's the regulations and the interpretive of the regulations is where the power is. So we've had witnesses very, very concerned about the powers you are now enlarging for the CRTC here. No matter what policy you're writing or directions you may give them, when you make statements of how the CRTC interprets those regulations, you've just empowered them. So that fine balance you're talking about moves over into their world, and that is not controlled by legislation.
I guess the point, Mr. Chair? I just want to make sure I can respond.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. The point that is important to know is that it's not it's around the applicability and how it can be applied. The direction is not an option. The direction needs to be implemented, but the how component of how it is being applied is subject to the expertise of the CRTC, which knows the environment, understands how it's evolving, and the application itself is what we're talking about. It's not about not doing what is in the direction. The direction is very clear. It's explicitly directed towards the application by the CRTC. But
I got that. But the statement was made was how they interpret. That's a different legal term, and we've got to be very careful here. Words are important. So when you say it's how the CRTC interprets, that's a different game than what you just said.
If I use that word, what I mean to say is how it applies. We leave some discretion on the application of that direction.
But words are important. So when we're having hearings like this, and you say those kinds of words, and we have witnesses that are very concerned that those things are going to be in the CRTC hands, that is a very, very enlargement of powers for the CRTC. I'm going to change to one other question for you.
Sure.
That it has been reported many times that the federal government is spending 80% of their advertising dollars on foreign social media. 80%. Why so much on foreign for Canadian taxpayers? Why not Canadian?
The government of Canada is the expenses for advertising is not managed by the Department of Canadian Heritage. This is done by
I'm asking your opinion. You want to protect Canadian media. You want to protect Canadian social media. That's what you three people are doing here.
Yep.
But yet you have no opinion, that it's just fine with you, it's nothing to do with you, but yet it's a source of revenue for our Canadian content, and without it, we're losing.
What I can tell you
Mr.
is...
Chair?
Yep.
Mr. Chair, if I may.
Is this a point of order, Mr. Brusen?
Yes.
Can you just stop the clock there for a second? I apologize. Let me just back up 1 second. I meant 6 minutes, not 7. I apologize again. Mr. Brusen, go ahead.
It's just because I'm not sure that members of our public service are to give. They don't give policy direction and opinions.
Thank you, Mr. Brusen. I appreciate your input, but I'm sure they're quite qualified to defend themselves. Mr. Shields.
Thank you. It's when we're talking about protection of a lot of things to do with Canadian content, and our media is a huge part of what we're talking about here. And we are supporting foreign media with our taxpayers' money. Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Shields. Appreciate that. Now we go to Ms. Ian.
Mr. Chair, thank you so very much. This question is for either Mr. Piché, Mr. Ripley, or Ms. Choi. Feel free to take it. Just want to know how this bill is going to level the playing field, but with a perspective, with a lens on community or local broadcasters. We heard from several witnesses who were concerned that community broadcasters were left out. And they talked a lot about media deserts, news deserts in rural areas where, the large broadcasters aren't. So just wondering how this bill will level the playing field with regards to those things, given a community lens.
I will start. This bill will act on two. So, of course, leveling the playing field is very important in terms